Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come by John Fox Jr., Chapter 3, Part 1, A Blab School on Kingdom Come. Chad was awakened by the touch of a cold nose at his ear, the rasp of a warm tongue across his face, and the tug of two paws at his cover. "Get down, Jack," he said, and Jack, with a whimper of satisfaction, went back to the fire that was roaring up the chimney, and a deep voice laughed and called, "I reckon you better get up, little man." Old Joel was seated at the fire with his huge legs crossed and a pipe in his mouth. It was before busily astir. There was the sound of tramping in the frosty air outside and the noise of getting breakfast ready in the kitchen. As Chad sprang up, he saw Melissa's yellow hair drop out of sight behind the foot of the bed in the next corner, and he turned his face quickly and, slipping behind the foot of his own bed and into his coat and trousers, was soon at the fire itself, with old Joel looking him over with shrewd kindliness. "Yo' dog's got a heap of sense," said the old hunter, and Chad told him how old Jack was and how a cattle buyer from the settlements of the Bluegrass had given him to Chad when Jack was badly hurt and his owner thought he was going to die. And now Chad had nursed him, and how the two had always been together ever since. Through the door of the kitchen, Chad could see the old mother with her crane and pots and cooking pans. Outside, he could hear the moo of the old brindle, the bleat of her calf, the nicker of a horse, and one lusty sheep call, and the hungry bellow of young cattle at the barn where Tall Tom was feeding the stock. Presently, Rube stamped in with the back log, and Dolph came through with the milk pail. "I can milk," said Chad eagerly, and Dolph laughed. "All right, I'll give you a chance," he said, and old Joel looked pleased, for it was plain that the little stranger was not going to be a drone in the household, and taking his pipe from his mouth, but without turning his head, he called out, "Get up there, Melissy." Getting no answer, he looked around to find Melissa standing at the foot of the bed. "Come here to the fire, little gal. Nobody's a-going to eat you." Melissa came forward, twisting her hands in front of her, and stood rubbing one bare foot over the other on the hearthstones. She turned her face with a blush when Chad suddenly looked at her, and thereafter the little man gazed steadily into the fire in order not to embarrass her any more. With the breaking of light over the mountain, breakfast was over and the work of the day begun. Tom was off to help a neighbor snake logs down the mountain and into Kingdom Come, where they would be rafted and floated on down the river to the capital, if a summer tide should come, to be turned into fine houses for the people of the Bluegrass. Dolph and Rube disappeared at old Joel's order to go meet them sheep. Melissa helped her mother clear away the table and wash the dishes, and Chad, out of the tail of his eye, saw her surreptitiously feeding greedy Jack while old Joel sat by the fire smoking silently. Chad stepped outside. The air was chill, but the mists were rising, and a long band of rich warm light lay over a sloping spur up the river, and where this met the blue morning shadows, the dew was beginning to drip and to sparkle. Chad could not stand inaction long, and his eye lighted up when he heard a great bleating at the foot of the spur and the shouts of men and boys. Just then the old mother called from the rear of the cabin, "Joel, them sheep are coming." The big form of the old hunter filled the doorway, and Jack bounded out between his legs, while little Melissy appeared with 2 books ready for school. Down the road came the flock of lean mountain sheep, Dolph and Rube driving them. Behind slouched the Dillon tribe, Dawes and Whizzer and little Tad. Dawes' father, old Tad, long, lean, stooping, crafty, and 2 new ones, cousins to Dawes, Jake and Jerry, the giant twins. "Joel Turner," said old Tad sourly, "here's your sheep." Joel had bought the Dillon sheep and meant to drive them to the county seat 10 miles down the river. There had evidently been a disagreement between the two when the trade was made, for Joel pulled out a gray pouch of coonskin, took from it a roll of bills, and without counting them, held them out. "Dad Dillon, here's your money." The Dillon father gave possession with a gesture, and the Dillon faction, including Whizzer and the giant twins, drew aside together, the father morose. Dawes watching Dolph, and Rube with a look of much meanness. Little Tad behind him watching Chad, his face screwed up with hate. And Whizzer pretending not to see Jack, but darting a surreptitious glance at him now and then, for then and there was starting a feud that was to run fiercely on long after the war was done. "Get my hoss, Rube," said old Joel, and Rube turned to the stable while Dolph kept an eye on the sheep which were lying on the road or straggling down the river. As Rube opened the stable door, a dirty white object bounded out, and Rube, with a loud curse, tumbled over backward into the mud while a fierce old ram dashed with a triumphant bleat for the open gate. Beelzebub, as the Turner mother had christened the mischievous brute, had been placed in the wrong stall, and Beelzebub was making for freedom. He gave another triumphant bah as he swept between Dolph's legs and through the gate, and with an answering chorus the silly sheep sprang to their feet and followed. Now a sheep hates water, but not more than he loves a leader, and Beelzebub feared nothing. Straight for the water of the low ford the old conqueror made, and in the wake of his masterful summons the flock swept like a Mormon household after him. Then was there a commotion indeed. Old Joel shouted and swore, Dolph shouted and swore, and Rube shouted and swore. Old Dillon smiled grimly. Dawes and little Tad shouted with derisive laughter, and the big twins grinned. The mother came to the door, broom in hand, and with a frowning face watched the sheep splash through the water and into the woods across the river. Little Melissa looked frightened, and Whizzer lost his head, had run down after the sheep, barking and hastening their flight, until called back with a mighty curse from old Joel. While Jack sat on his haunches looking at Chad and waiting for orders. "God Almighty," said Joel, "how are we going to get them sheep back?" Up and rose the bleating and buying, for Beelzebub, like the prince of devils that he was, seemed bent on making all the mischief possible. How are we going to get 'em back?" Chad nodded then, and Jack, with an eager yelp, made for the river, Whizzer at his heels. Again old Joel yelled furiously, as did Dolph and Rube, and Whizzer stopped and turned back with a drooping tail, but Jack plunged in. He knew but one voice behind him, and Chad's was not in the chorus. "Call your old dog back, boy," said Joel sternly, and Chad opened his lips with anything but a call for Jack to come back. It was instead a fine high yell of encouragement, and old Joel was speechless. "That dog will kill them sheep," said Dawes Dillon aloud. Joel's face was red and his eyes rolled. "Call that damn fice back, I tell you," he shouted at last. "Hey, you Rube, get my gun, get my gun." Rube started for the house, but Chad laughed. Jack had reached the other bank now and was flashing like a ball of gray light through the weeds and up into the woods, and Chad slipped down the bank and into the river, eyeing him on excitedly. Joel was beside himself, and he too lumbered down to the river, followed by Dolph, while the Dillons roared from the road. "Boy," he roared. "Hey, boy, hey, what's his name, Dolph? Call him back. Dolph, call the little devil back. If I don't wear him out with a hickory, holler for damn him." "Ee-wee!" The old hunter's bellow rang through the woods like a dinner horn. Dolph was shouting too, but Jack and Chad seemed to have gone stone deaf, and Rube, who had run down with the gun, started with an oath into the river himself. But Joel halted him. Hold on," he said, listening. "By the eternal, he's a rounding 'em up." The sheep were evidently much scattered to judge from the bleating, but here, there, and everywhere they could hear Jack's bark, while Chad seemed to have stopped in the woods and from one place was shouting orders to his dog. Plainly, Jack was no sheep killer, and by, Dolph and Rube left off shouting, and old Joel's face became placid, and all of them, from swearing helplessly, fell to waiting quietly. Soon the bleating became less and less and began to concentrate on the mountainside. Not far below, they could hear Chad. "Coo, sheep, coo. Sheep koozie, koozie, sheep." The sheep were answering. They were coming down a ravine, and Chad's voice rang out. "Somebody come across and stand on each side of the holler." Dolph and Rube waded across then, and soon the sheep came crowding down the narrow ravine, with Jack barking behind them and Chad shooing them down. But for Dolph and Rube, Beelzebub would have led them up or down the river, and it was hard work to get him into the water till Jack, who seemed to know what the matter was, sharply nipped several sheep near him. These sprang violently forward. The whole flock in front pushed forward too, and Beelzebub was thrust from the bank. Nothing else being possible, the old ram settled himself with a snort into the water and made for the other shore. Chad and Jack followed, and when they reached the road, Beelzebub was again a prisoner. The sheep, swollen like sponges, were straggling down the river, and Dillons and Turners were standing around in silence. Jack shook himself and dropped panting in the dust at his master's feet, without so much as an upward glance or a lift of his head for a pat of praise. As old Joel raised one foot heavily to his stirrup, he grunted quietly, "Well, I'll be damned." And when he was comfortably in his saddle, he said again with unction, "I do be damned. I'll just take that dog to help drive them sheep down to town. Come on, boy." Chad started joyfully, but the old mother called from the door, "Who's a-going to take this gal to school, I'd like to know?" Old Joel pulled in his horse, straightened one leg, and looked all round, first at the Dillons, who had started away, then at Dolph and Rube, who were moving determinedly after the sheep, because it was court day in town, and they could not miss court day. And then at Chad, who halted. "Boy," he said, "don't you want to go to school? You ought to go to school." "Yes," said Chad obediently, though the trip to town, and Chad had never been to a town, was a sore temptation. "Go on, then. Tell the teacher I sent you. Here, Mammy. Hey, what's your name, boy?" "Oh, Mammy, Chad here'll take her. Take good care of that gal, boy, and learn your abs like a man now." Melissa came shyly forward from the door, and Joel whistled to Jack and called him, but Jack, though he liked nothing better than to drive sheep, lay still looking at Chad. "Go along, Jack," said Chad, and Jack sprang up and was off, though he stopped again and looked back. Chad had to tell him again to go on. In a moment, dog, men, and sheep were moving in a cloud of dust around a bend in the road, and little Melissa was at the gate. End of Chapter 3, Part 1.